My name is Simon Freed, and I'm the events coordinator for the Distinguished Speaker Award. And I want to thank everybody for attending the Hill Country Region Distinguished Speaker Series. We have members from other regions tonight. I think we have members from both Maverick and Longhorn. So we have all of Zone 5. Is that correct, Carl?
That's correct.
Okay. I want to thank Gordy Robbins, the secretary, for setting this up, and Carl Rossi, our president. Carl, would you like to say a couple of words?
Just very briefly, Simon, thank you very much for setting this up. I think we've got a very good turnout tonight. Tuffy Von Briesen, our Zone 5 rep, I don't know if he's on or not, but he did send this out a notice out to the entire zone. So welcome the rest of the regions from Zone 5. And Ryan Stark is here, and he's got a very interesting presentation, which I found that there is a lot of real interest in hearing, Ryan. So the burden's on you now, Ryan.
So, Brian, do you want to give a little bit of background, or shall I?
You can go ahead if you want to, or it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, Ryan Stark is the president of Blackstone Labs. They're an oil analysis firm in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I've been sending my oil there for, well, ever since I've moved to Texas. Ryan is a mechanical engineer degree from Purdue University, which is almost as good as Michigan State. He's an expert in oil analysis and power analysis of oil for engines and transmissions and other types of hydraulic systems. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan.
Okay, thank you, Simon and Carl and Gordy. I appreciate you guys hosting this and inviting me. I always enjoy talking about oil and oil analysis, and especially for as cool of vehicles as the Porsches are. We do a lot of samples from them, so it's a good information to give out, and I hope to learn a few things too by questions, and maybe you guys can give me a few pointers here and there. But so I'll go ahead and start my presentation now, and I believe if there's any questions, Simon was gonna kind of weed those out, and hopefully some of my questions will probably be answered in the presentation. But if not, we'll have some Q&A time afterwards, and we can certainly catch them there. So, and I believe you're welcome to ask questions as you go along. If it's something that I got that I have in my presentation already, I probably will wait for a little bit. But if it's not, and it's something that could be addressed right then, I'll probably go ahead and do it right there. So, but I'll go ahead and start my presentation now. So I am with Blackstone Laboratories. Our company was founded back in 1985 by my father, Jim Stark. I joined on in 1997 after college and have been working ever since. We've got my sister, Kristen. She's the vice president, but that's pretty much the extent of the family as far as that goes. We've got about 35 employees total, and are growing every year. So we do all different types of oils. So pretty much any type of oil out there, we can analyze it. There's some labs out there that just focus on mainly automotive, gas and diesels, or some focus primarily on aircraft or industrial, but we kind of do everything. And it gives us a little bit of a different perspective on a lot of things that we get to see. You know, we see a lot of aircraft and really a lot of interesting things. And really it does make the job interesting if we've got a whole big variety of different things. It's not like we're seeing the same engine over and over again. So it's a interesting job, and I really enjoy doing it. So I always like to go through, the basic functions of oil. And a lot of this is stuff that, you guys obviously know. Lubrication's the big one. Obviously it's required in order to keep the parts moving. But it's a big one as far as cooling goes. And that's really, the oil cools all engines, not just air-cooled engines, but air-cooled engines primarily really rely on the coolant of the oil, the oil coolings factor. And I know some of the Porsches have a lot of huge oil supplies just for that they have, a lot of oil to circulate through the engine. They spend, they've got quite a bit of plumbing to cool it down. And so it's really big in the air-cooled industry, or for the air-cooled engines as well as the liquid-cooled engines. So, but that's a big function of the oil. And now clean, you guys have probably heard the cleaning function of oil, and a lot of people are kind of confused about what that does and how it works. And it's really just, it's not really cleaning the engine as far as if it was dirty, it wouldn't make it cleaner. It's more like the function of oil. And when you change it, oil's got detergent dispersant additives that are supposed to hold solids in suspension. So when you change the oil, those solids leave with the oil and they don't stay in the engine. That's what the a big function of the cleaning process goes. And if you do regular oil changes, then there's no reason that your engine should be dirty to start with, because all these oils will have some detergent dispersant additives. So, and finally, if you do oil analysis, we can provide a lot of good information about your engine. We can see all kinds of problems that might develop from bearing problems, piston scuffing, valve problems, antifreeze contamination, fuel dilution, silicon. There's a lot of different things that we can see. And but the only way you can see it is if you sample your oil. So that's a big function, obviously, what we're here for. So the functions: oil analysis, predicting problems, seeing wear problems, and we read the metals at such low levels that we're reading in the parts per million range, which is extremely small. And the good thing about that is we can see these problems develop long before they actually cause an engine failure. So if we'll see high wear in a certain area, we know you might be having a little problem here or there. A lot of times, we'll see it in the such early stages that you can go ahead and make changes, whatever you need to fix that. If it's something that's being brought on by an operational circumstance, you have the ability to change that around a little bit and get wear metals back on track. If it's something like an antifreeze problem, we'll see that long before it's actually going to cause a failure. And with that, you can have plenty of time to figure out if you want to fix the vehicle, or if it's time to, change vehicles, whatever you want to do. But predicting problems is probably the main function of oil analysis. So, and it accumulates metal from wear. And like I said, what we're seeing is down in the parts per million range. So we're actually seeing very small, extremely small particles of metal in order to do that. And contaminants are a big thing. Not only can we see antifreeze, we actually see antifreeze with the elements potassium and sodium. So for the liquid cool guys out there, if you have a little bit of antifreeze getting in, you'll see it in the elements potassium and sodium. We can see things like water contamination, excess fuel dilution, silicon from dirt, things along of that nature. So water, fuel, abrasive dirt, antifreeze, those are the big ones. You don't see much antifreeze in the air-cooled ones, obviously, but we can see it. And one thing to think about for oil analysis is it's good for both the pre-purchase inspections and as a selling point when you're ready to part with your vehicle. If you show whoever's thinking about buying it that you've got a nice, good history of oil analysis, they know you've been changing the oil, they know you've been doing all the maintenance that's required for that vehicle. And if you can give them a good stack of nice clean oil reports, it's really worth significant money. You should be able to get a premium, because who's ever buying it's going to know that they're buying a good vehicle. And pre-purchase inspections are sometimes difficult, because when you go into a vehicle and you don't necessarily know exactly what you're looking at as far as maintenance history, and it can be difficult. And sometimes if you do oil analysis, it can be of less value if they just change the oil. If they went through and changed the oil a couple 100 miles before that, we won't be able to tell you a whole lot. But if the oil's got some time on it, we've got wear averages that we can compare your engine to kind of get you baseline on how it should look. We know how all these engines should look, and if something's really far out of line, we can tell you that. And either maybe steer you away from that vehicle or possibly be able to work out a little bit better price on what might be a potential problem for you. So in these presentations, I always like to explain what we can't do. And so oil analysis is not a be all end all as far as maintenance goes. We can see a lot of stuff, but there's things that we can't do. And primarily the biggest one is we can't identify large chunks of metal. If your engine's making metal that's larger in size and say 10 or 15 microns, it's actually going to be too small for our machine to read. And I've got a picture of our spectrometer. I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but the spectrometer can only read the metals that are in solution in the oil. So if your engine's making large chunks of metal, say you've got a cam or a lifter problem where it's spalling and producing a lot of metal, that can be sometimes larger than we can see. Most of the time though, if your engine's making large chunks of metal, it'll also be wearing poorly and we'll be seeing that as well. So, but I do like to explain that we can't see everything. So, and sudden failures due to fatigue, that's another one that's thankfully doesn't happen too often. These engines, a lot of them are driven really hard. So fatigue failures are always a possibility. If you've got an older engine that's seen a lot of use, there can be cracks developing internally that are solely due to fatigue, not necessarily wear problems. And so you can have things like crankshaft snap and things like that, or we're pretty much blind to oil as far as seeing an oil analysis. So, but other than that, we can see a lot of stuff. It's pretty impressive what you can tell by just looking at the oil. So, I always like to go through too how to take a sample. We've got a lot of questions on that, and there's two really good ways of doing it. You can get a sample while the oil's draining. That's going to be your primary one, or you can draw one up the dipstick tube. So we sell a pump that you can do. It's reusable. So if you and that's especially useful on the pre-purchase inspections. If you're going out and buying a car, you're not sure you want it, you don't want to necessarily drain the oil. So we've got samples you can get a sample from the dipstick tube easily, and you're able to get a sample that way. Try not to get the first oil out of the engine or the last. So how I usually do it when I'm changing oil is I'll crack the plug and let it drain for maybe 10 seconds, and then I'll put the bottle under there and get a sample as it's draining out. It isn't really a major problem if you do get the very first oil out of the engine or the last. We don't like to get the first oil out because sometimes there can be some dirt caked around the oil plug. That's worse on some engines than others, maybe primarily construction vehicles. Some areas that get engines that get operated in extremely dirty environments, they have problems with those nature. And then too, if you wait till the very end, you might not get enough oil to fill the bottle. So that's why we try not to get the last oil out of the engine. The metals that we see in the oil are actually are very well suspended in the oil, and the oil is pretty well homogeneous. So you don't necessarily see any variations in the numbers from the first oil out of the engine or the last. There are just other factors on why you don't want to get the first oil out of the last. And another big thing is try not to start the engine right before sampling. This is something that in certain vehicles, mostly really actually carbureted vehicles more than anything. And so that's kind of a, for the older Porsche owners out there, if you still got a carbureted engine, all engines start rich. So when you start the engine, it's going to be pumping in more fuel than you'll actually need to after it's started. So if you start the engine right before it's running or before you sample, sometimes we'll get a little bit of excess fuel in the oil, and it won't necessarily be a problem, but it can mimic a problem or make something. If you had a fuel system problem already, it'll make it look significantly worse. So try not to start the engine right before sampling. Probably the best thing to do is to get a sample. I think probably the ideal way of getting a sample is to go out for a drive, nice long drive, maybe a half hour, get the oil up to operating temperature. If you get it up to operating temperature, it's going to boil out any water that might be in there or any fuel dilution. All that stuff will get boiled out as the oil gets hot. Well, get home, park it in the garage, let it cool down a little bit. Nothing's worth burning your hands over as far as getting a sample, but you let it cool down for a half hour, 45 minutes, and then drain the oil. And the nice thing about that is as it's draining, if it's hot, more oil is going to drain out than if the engine's cold. So that's probably the ideal situation. But really, the only thing we really try to avoid is starting the engine. If it's parked out in the street and you have to pull it into the garage or something like that, if you have to do it, it's not a big deal. And if you just write us a note that you did that on the sample slip, then we'll take that into account when we're writing the report. And try to do it the same way every time. You know, if you get the oil, if you're consistent in how you take the sample, then we're going to be giving you consistent results, that we won't have problems that show up from maybe you changed the oil one way this time and then another way that time. If you're consistent in how you do it, then that's another really good thing to do. So, and don't forget to fill out the oil information slip. So here's an example of a typical oil information slip, and this is going to be pretty well standard. A lot of what we ask is going to be similar to what other labs might ask. Always like to point out a few things that can be a little bit confusing for customers. We've got what's known as a unit ID up here, and we've got a little parentheses. What do you want to call it? So a lot of people will call it, 2010 911 or 08 Boxster, whatever you want to call it. Or if you got a special name, you can put it on there. It's as far as that goes. Black Beauty, you can be creative. It doesn't really matter to us, but the unit ID is how we track history. So if you send in a sample again and again, if you always call it the same, then we'll make sure to pick up history for that vehicle, and we can track trends that way. So oil added between changes, it's fairly self-explanatory, but really what we're looking for there is how much oil you added. When you say you check the oil and see it's a quart low, you add a quart. That's what we want to know. We don't necessarily want to know how low the oil was when you changed it. We don't want to know sump size. It's nice to know sump size. We don't necessarily know that for a lot of vehicles, so it's interesting to have. But really what we want to know is how much oil you added for makeup to bring it back up to full, because we take that into account. As you're adding fresh oil to an engine, that oil is going to dilute the metals that are already in there. So it's nice to kind of have an idea of what you're adding in there and how much dilution could be a factor. So and it's also good if you keep good track of that. We'll track it on the oil report. That's a section on our report where we look at makeup oil, and so you can look back and use that to tell kind of how much makeup oil did you add 3 years ago when you sampled versus now, and it's a good way to identify problems. So on the back of the slip, we do ask a couple questions. Most of these are self-explanatory, and I'll talk about the TBN a little bit later, but interested in extended oil use. That's not necessarily a big concern for sports car owners. A lot of guys, enjoy changing oil. I'm one of them. I like to change the oil in my own vehicles and consider it a good time, really. But if you've ever wondered if you're changing oil too soon, you can check yes on that, and we'll tell you if we think you can run the oil longer. It's not anything that's a binding or no contract. You don't have to follow our recommendations, but if you do say, you're changing oil 3,000, you want to go 5,000 for some reason or another, or you want to change oil, every 18 months as opposed to 12 months, you can check yes on that, and we'll give you what we think. If the oil can be run longer, we'll let you know, and we'll let you know how long we think it can be run. So, but yeah, fill out the slip. The more information you give us on the slip, the better our report's going to be. If you have comments like you notice you had some extra work done, you had some valve cover replacements done or something like that, that's always good information for us as report writers. We'll see that, and a lot of times we'll see stuff in the report that will be we can tie directly to the comments and questions. Any kind of question you have, we always try to answer those in the comments of the report. So on the test we run, here's the spectrometer. This is the heart of what we do. It's a ICP spectrometer. Stands for inductively coupled plasma, and it uses an argon plasma to basically burn the oil. The optical side of the machine, which is over here, looks at the light coming out of the plasma and can identify, it looks at the intensity of light, and it can separate that light into different wavelengths each wavelength of light corresponds with a certain element that we read. So iron will have a certain wavelength, aluminum will have a certain wavelength, calcium. And so the optical side of the machine can look at the intensity of light coming off that plasma, and it knows what kind of, how many parts per million of each sample or each element are in the sample. So a very important machine for us. If I can only do one test on the oil, it's the spectrometer. So, but we do 4 tests on the standard analysis. The spectral exam's the primary one. We test viscosity as well, and it's a pretty basic test. It's really, as far as tests on the oil goes, it's one of the oldest ones out there. It was developed back when Henry Ford decided he wanted to put some oil in his engine, and they needed a way to quantify the viscosity. And this is a kinematic viscosity tube. You put oil in this side, and this is actually an oil bath at 100 degrees C, and you time how long it takes the oil to go from this mark down to that mark. So it's a really basic, simple test. It's hard to fool. Sometimes the oil on diesel engines especially is so black it's hard to see the marks, but other than that, it's a really easy test to run, and we can tell a lot by that. We know what the oil should be. If you tell us what the oil should be, if it's a 040 or a 2050, something like that, then when we do the viscosity, that tells us if it is indeed the oil that it should be. If the oil's not that, if it changes in viscosity, then that can be problematic in certain situations, and this test tells us that. Our next test that we do is the flash point, and this is the Cleveland Open Cup flash point. This is a fun test. We actually take a little bit of oil and heat it. These are Bunsen burners, high-powered Bunsen burners. These are preheats, and then the main burners are here. This one's actually caught on fire. We actually heat the oil up until the vapors coming off the oil ignite. And that's a physical property of the oil, very similar to the flash point. It shouldn't, very similar to the viscosity. And it shouldn't change from when you pour the oil out of the bottle into your engine, but it does. And some change is normal, but if it changes too much, then that can be a problem. And what we primarily look at with this test is fuel dilution. So we read actually how much fuel is in the oil based on how low the flash point is below a certain level. So it's again a test that's been around for a really long time. A nice thing about this test too is when we're running it, if an oil's got water in it, when we pour it into one of these brass cups, they are brass actually. When you pour it in a hot brass cup, if oil's got water in it, it'll boil and sizzle and crackle. So we can tell positive or negative if water is present. Excuse me. The last test on our standard analysis is the insolubles test. And what this is total solids in the oil by volume. And we're really the only labs that do this test. It's a good test because it tells us, okay, we can visually see the amount of solids that are present. And what we're looking at on this insolubles tube are the solids that we take the oil and we mix it with some petroleum ether, which is a solvent. We shake it up and run it in a heated centrifuge, and the solids that are in the oil actually settle to the bottom of the tube. I've lost my mouse. There it is. And we quantify this, and you'll see that on the report as percent insolubles. That tells us how well your oil filter is doing. If you've got oil filter problems, if it's not doing well enough, and we'll see high levels of insolubles, or if your engine's making so many solids that the oil filter can't handle it, then that tells us also, we'll see that is in the insolubles as well. And also with this test, if an oil's got water in it, we'll see it with the flash point test, but we can quantify it by how much water is present at the bottom of this tube. So a good test. It'd be hard to do oil analysis without it. It'd be all these tests kind of combine to make one overall picture of how well the oil's doing. Another common test that we get requests for is called the TBN, or total base number. And this is something we don't include this as our standard analysis in our standard analysis package, just because the information that it provides is interesting. It's got a lot of good information, but it doesn't it's not that critical for a lot of our customers. So what you're looking at here is an auto titrator, and it's basically a computer controlled. It's got a pH meter, and you mix the oil with some chemicals and add some chemicals to it to get a TBN reading. The TBN again stands for total base number, and it's kind of like pH on the oil, on an oil, but not really. You can't run pHs on oils directly because it's not the right type of molecule, but you can mix chemicals with it and add some acids to it to see how much acid solution can absorb. So, and what this would be important for you guys is measure the total base number, measures the active additive that's present in the oil when the oil starts. So as the oil, when it's fresh out of the bottle, the TBN is going to be the highest it's going to be. And then as the oil gets used, the TBN drops. When it gets down to a certain level, that can mean the oil's out of active additive and should be changed. So this is just an extra $10. Again, a lot of our customers don't need it, so it's not included as part of the standard analysis, but you're more than welcome to request it. We have that question on the back of the slip. So when I do these kind of presentations, I always like to try to go through. We see a lot of Porsche engines, a lot of them. We'll probably see 15, 20 a day almost, maybe not that much in that area though. We see a lot of them. And so when we see these, we know they've got some certain problems. And I know this is maybe one that could possibly have been a little bit overblown unless you've had it fail. But the IMS bearing, the intermediate shaft bearing is one that we've always we train any new report writers that we hire. We train them to look for this type of problem so they know these engines have them. Certain engines, we kind of have it narrowed down to what years we think these problems are. This one's a particularly hard problem to spot because of how the problem is with the bearing not necessarily being when they fail. We have to see the metal. Any oil that gets splashed in there has to leave enough metal for us to see. So it's a difficult one to spot. And in fact, I don't know that we've seen any necessarily that are for sure 100%. This one failed at the IMS, and here was the samples leading up to it. We'll get a lot of samples from engines that have had the IMS replaced already. So those aren't as much of a concern, obviously, but this is something that we look for. Iron is really pretty much the main thing that we look for, just a little bit of extra iron. But then too, if our customers tell us they're having an oil leak, we know oil leaks, especially something that looks like a rear main seal around the crankshaft. That's something that always lights a light bulb in our head and say, you might have this problem. And it's the type of problem, obviously, if anybody's had it, that the failures can be pretty catastrophic. So you really want to avoid them if you can. And, obviously get that replaced more proactively than wait to the failure. So, but that's one of the things that we see. But as I was trying to go through and come up with problems, really, we don't see that many problems. These engines are really well built, solid engines. You have some situations like this with IMS bearing going bad. That's obviously, it was a design flaw that was inherent in the engine. So there's not much you can do about that. But things like antifreeze leaks, those are extremely rare in Porsches. And that might just be a lot of them being horizontally opposed. They just don't have the type of failures that, certain other engines, certain types of V arrangements will have, be more susceptible to antifreeze contamination and things like that. So, but another thing, here's an example report. So this is what I would imagine a possible IMS problem showing up as, and this is one we just did not too long ago. So on our report here, we've got a comment section where we go through and we have analysts that looks at the data. We don't expect our customers to know what these numbers mean. So we always try to go through and explain in plain English exactly what we're seeing. The current sample data is right here. This is the spectral results. We've got some physical properties down here, viscosity, flash point. If we measure fuel, we'll see it. This customer got a TBN, his read 8.9, which is really high. That's plenty good. We've also got averages over here on the right side. So we know what this type of engine should look like to start with. And so we always compare this sample to average. And so this sample, really, we didn't notice anything too far out of line. We did see a little bit of iron show up, and we know that a little bit of excess iron could potentially show that problem. This customer also mentioned that he did have an oil leak. So I wanted to, when I wrote the report, I wanted to make sure that he knew about it, and that's a symptom, and he should be watching for it. So this particular sample, he also had a timing chain work done. So anytime you pull parts off of an engine, like a timing chain cover, if you have to replace anything in there, when you put stuff back together, there'll be a wear-in period for a new engine that it'll be producing more metal than it would otherwise. So a lot of this could be from a timing chain problem, or the timing chain work that he had done. The steel, the iron would be from the steel chain itself, going through a little wear in, and then silicon could be from sealers. When they put the cover back on, a lot of times they'll use a silicone sealer around that. So this is wasn't a cut and dry case of an IMS failure, but this is what I would imagine one might look like, just a little bit of extra iron. So not the best example report, but again, the failures of that nature, a lot of times, they're not doing samples beforehand, so they won't know about it, and don't know about the failure till it happens. So hopefully enough people that it's been around for a long time, that I think hopefully the majority of the people that have these engines know about them and are getting it fixed. But there's always the new person buying their first Porsche and might not know about it. So it's something good to watch for. Another possible problem, piston cylinder scuffing. This could potentially happen to pretty much any engine out there. It's always a possible concern. It isn't as much of a concern with the liquid cooled engines, but I would guess it could probably potentially be more of an issue for the air cooled guys. I know it's an issue for in the aviation world. They get piston scuffing and cylinder scuffing all the time. What we see there is traditionally aluminum and iron. Those will read high. Could possibly also have silicon, if depending on the cylinder type. So we know Porsches have sometimes will have a unique cylinder arrangements. They're not just steel cylinders, which are going to be most of your production cars out there. Fords, GMs, most of those all have basic steel cylinders, but the Porsches can have alusil, a certain type of ceramic cylinders. They can have Nicosil cylinders. So there's different types of cylinder metallurgy that is important to keep in mind for us when we're writing the report. So if we see high aluminum, iron, and silicon, we'll also often think about piston scuffing as a potential problem. I wouldn't say it's an epidemic on these engines by any means, but it's always something that we look for. High oil consumption is an example of what those problems how you can identify the problems early on. If you notice your engine's starting to burn more oil than it had been traditionally, that's a possible sign of that. And here's an example where we knew the engine had some scuffing problems. And again, it's not making really a huge amount of metal. If you look at the averages, this average, we don't say here what it is, but this average is usually based on anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 miles of oil use. So he's gotten 5,000 miles there, a little under 4,000 there. Nothing's really too crazy early on, but then we noticed aluminum going up and iron went up, and here he had a little bit of silicon go up too. So these were, again, not extremely high. And in fact, when we wrote the report, we didn't necessarily know that he had a problem. We did, or what type of problem he had, but we can say, okay, aluminum goes up. Aluminum's traditionally from pistons, can be from the cylinders in this case. So, and it's something that they're going to watch. So maybe related. He might have mentioned cylinder scoring on this. That he might have included that information with the sample. So, but again, this is the type of thing, as an analyst, I look at these metals. I always kind of look at the ratio of metals. Iron's going to be the base metal in all these engines just because there's so many steel parts. But when you see something like aluminum read almost at the same level of iron, something's not right. And that could be a good time to start really digging into it, see if you can see what's going on. So this was kind of a unique one where we actually did know about the failure. It's always nice if a failure does happen, if we get feedback. It's really feedback for us is worth its weight in gold almost. If we can have that, it really helps us. and it helps, it makes us smarter, and then it turns around and makes the community in general smarter, because we can tell other people what we think might potentially be a problem. So any feedback you have is always great. We love that type of stuff. So and then there's things that are obvious problems. We get samples like this on a semi-regular basis, once or twice a week, where we'll see what looks like possibly detonation. Can be ultra high wear typically, and usually from engines that have modifications. So you'll get people that have a need for more power necessarily than the engine was designed for, and so they'll do things to add superchargers or do things on tuning. There's a lot of things that you can do in computer controlled engines that can really produce more power than they were designed to do, and detonation is always a possibility in those situations. Oh, I went backwards, sorry. For modern engines that haven't been modified, this is really virtually impossible to get this type of problem unless you were to get some really bad gas or something along those lines, or have some sensors go out in the engine. But these engines all have NOx sensors on them, and if the computer control unit detects a knock, it'll automatically enrichen the mixture, retard the timing, or advance the timing, whatever it needs to do to get rid of the NOx. So the computers themselves on modern engines protect the engine, and it's really extremely impressive to see that. And anybody there's a lot of people out there that might not be necessarily on board with complete computer control for your engine. They may be like the back in the old days when you could actually work on stuff, and I understand that that there's a certain amount of knowledge that you don't have when the engine's controlled by a computer. But you should keep in mind that they really do a nice job on controlling them, and it's almost impossible to destroy them because they were designed with safety in mind as far as keeping the engine running, and things like NOx sensors are important on that. Excuse me. So, but these are always a concern with air-cooled engines, and we don't necessarily see that a lot, but when we do see it in a Porsche, now this isn't an air-cooled engine, so this isn't really the perfect example, but this is an engine that was modified for racing and saw some extremely heavy-duty use, and the metals show you can really see some poor wear in there. Typical wear for this engine would be over here, 3 parts per million. Aluminum's normal. On a typical oil run, he's got 136. So it's pretty obvious some problems are happening with this engine. A lot of chrome's going to be from your rings. Iron's going to be from steel parts. Cylinders, there are certain types of coatings on pistons that can give you iron. Copper is going to be from a bronze bushings usually. Sometimes brass fittings can give you copper. Aluminum is also a bearing metal in modern engines, so that's now two places really, pistons and bearings. But on older engines, lead is still a bearing metal that's primary, and then we'll also see lead if you use any kind of a leaded octane booster or something like that. This engine could possibly have had nickel cylinders, Nickel cylinders, so that nickel is an element that we read, and it was reading excessively. Silver is a kind of unusual one that can be a bearing metal as well, so that's anytime you get that level of silver, that's a potential problem, as well as silicon. So we didn't know exactly what happened to this engine, so when we write a comment for it, we basically list all the stuff that's out of line and try to say, obviously you've got something going on here that's a concern, so you're going to want to dig into the engine. This would be a cautionary report for pretty much anything that we see, and we'd tell you probably to get the engine looked at before it sees any more use, so else it'll destroy itself if it hasn't already. So fuel dilution is another thing that we look at. I already mentioned how it lowers the flash point and viscosity of the oil. And certain levels of fuel, it's hard to get around it. There's certain operational circumstances that tend to put fuel in the oil on a normal basis. For myself personally, I only live about 5 minutes away from work, so my car never gets warm. Unless I was to take a drive out of town for some reason or another, across town, I'm always working with cold oil that's got a lot of fuel in it just from the startup procedure. And that gets into the oil and then tends to lower the flash point and viscosity. So doesn't necessarily cause poor wear. And it's one of those problems when it happens. It isn't you don't have to stop everything, get out your tools and figure it out necessarily. These type of problems can happen, but they take a long time to manifest, sometimes 50,000 miles. But usually what happens if you got fuel dilution again and again into high level, say it was something other than operational, like a bad fuel injector, some types of fuel pumps, if they're mechanically driven, can get you extra fuel in the oil. Carburetors, if they're running too rich, things of that nature, you can get extra fuel in the oil. And what happens in those situations is the fuel actually is a contaminant that causes the oil control ring to get sludged up. And so you start burning oil. And so that's a sign that fuel system problems really starting to become more of an issue for the whole engine overall. So oil consumption is always something good to watch. And this type of problem can sneak up on you too. I've had vehicles that didn't burn a drop of oil for 100,000 miles, and you get complacent and don't even check the oil after a while. At least I did. Pretty soon starts making a little funny noise, and you pop the hood and check it. You're down 2 quarts of oil, and all of a sudden the engine started burning oil. And but in that particular situation, it always had excess fuel no matter what I did. And so I assumed that the oil control rings were shot at that point and, had to do something. So the oil consumption is always something good to watch. And it's easy to watch. It's hard to remember that if you added quarts though, so it's something good to write down. And another thing to keep in mind too is certain types of additives can mimic fuel dilution. There's a lot of solvent type additives out there that will just by their nature, they're added to engines to help clean sludge out of the engine. And so they're solvents, and they actually, those generally really pretty well do a good job. They do clean the stuff out. I don't know that necessarily helps the engine any, because when you add a solvent additive to an engine that might have had some sludge in there, the first thing that solvent does is knocks the oil, knocks the sludge out, and then circulates through the whole engine. Usually it'll cause so much solids to form in the filter that the filter bypasses, and then you're running the sludge and stuff through the bearings. So that's not necessarily a good thing overall. But if you do use a solvent additive, probably if you should use it on a regular basis, and let us know about it so we don't get fooled into thinking that you have a fuel system problem. So, and here's an example of what might be a potentially starting early stages of fuel system problem. This engine looked pretty good. The wear metals look fine. There's no problems at all. We got some pretty good history. He's not really burning much in the way of oil, not putting many miles or hours on the oil. He's probably tracking miles, not putting many in the way of miles. So it doesn't see a lot of use overall. But when we start seeing fuel anything above 2%, we always kind of start to worry about maybe you might have a fuel system problem. Something like this could be a stuck injector, bad fuel injector that's not spraying quite right. Sometimes fuel system additives can help that, or sometimes you just need to go out and run more. So a lot of the problems that happen with these engines could be brought on by the fact that they just don't see that much use. So there's always that in mind. But this isn't necessarily a problematic report. If you were to get one like that, we just tell you it's something to watch. Sometimes you can see an increase in the oil level on the dipstick. So that's always something good. If you have a serious problem, if you notice that your engine's making oil, that's never a good sign. Fuel or antifreeze are usually the 2 symptoms of that. There's certain types of engines that have that problem on a pretty regular basis. Porsche engines really aren't that. So again, I had trouble finding good example reports of problems because these engines really are pretty solid and don't have that many problems with them. So another problem that can show up, I got a pretty good story for you guys. I don't really have very much experience with Porsches. Personally, I've never owned one, but my brother-in-law bought one a couple years ago. It was his dream car. He went out. He lived up in Dyer, Indiana, which is by Chicago, up in that region, and he always wanted to have an old Porsche, a 911 air cooled. So he found one online. I don't know where he found it, but it's out in California. And he had to go all the way out to California to get it. So his buddy drove him out there and he found it, fell in love with it, bought it, and decided to drive it all the way back cross country back to home. So, you know, he looked at it, checked it out, did a test drive, everything looked good, checked the oil, added some oil to it, and got in his car and started driving back. And he was just getting on the road. He's cruising along, you know, having fun as a T-top, as a 78 Targa, a 911, sweet looking car. He still got it. But as he was driving along, he's cruising along the highway, and he looked over, and a guy was next to him on his motorcycle saying, "Hey, your car's on fire." So he looked, it turns out when he checked the oil, he didn't realize that on dry sump engines, you have to check those while the engine's running. So he checked the oil while the engine was stopped. And of course, it looked like it needed some oil, because all the oil at that point drains into the engine. So he got it out, and he didn't really damage the vehicle at all. So that's good. But rookie errors like that can happen. I always think that's a pretty funny story on something. You had to take a guy that's used to, you know, GM 350s and things like that. Dealing with a completely different oil setup is something that's pretty funny. And I just thought that's a funny story, especially because it had a happy ending. He didn't destroy the engine or the vehicle. So what we see on this is, you know, when we do see something that might potentially be a problem, there's always questions on what to do then at that point. A lot of times, again, we see metals show up that are necessarily maybe just a little bit out of line, and something that we want to talk about. A lot of times we'll just have you check back, but if it looks like a serious problem, then we've always got some suggestions, and oil analysis is just one tool in your toolbox. If you see something that might potentially be a problem, you know, watching oil consumption changes. That's always a big thing. I've kind of harped on that. It's awfully easy to add a quart and then forget about it. I've done it myself, but really, if you can try to jot down how much oil that you've added and keep track of it over the years, you can see when these problems start just basically by how your oil consumption increases, things like that. So that's a big thing, watching, and that's an easy thing to do. Just write it down. Oil filter inspection. This is one that's has been used for a long time in the aviation industry. This is how you get around the problem of us not being able to see large chunks of metal. If you cut open the filter and look for large chunks of metal, and it's glittered with, you know, full of glitter from metal, then it's a pretty good idea that you got a problem. So we see these occasionally. We actually have a filter analysis program that we do, primarily set up for aviation, but the automotive guys can send them into. It's pretty interesting to see what shows up in filters. This example of one that's fairly clean, you can see a little bit of metal here and there. A little bit of carbon shows up. The carbon's normal. A few specks here and there really aren't too bad, and it's primarily aluminum is what you'll see. But you'll also want to run a magnet over your filter. If your engine's making metal, you want to know about it. If it's producing a lot of steel, it'll stick to the magnet. When we do these, we take a little bit of saran wrap and cover our magnet, just else because it's really hard to get the steel filings off of the magnet after you check them. But you can buy filter cutters. They're readily available online. Cut it open. This is the type of thing, you don't have to send it in. You don't have to really even know anything about it. You can open up your filter. Actually, you'll want to let it drain for a couple of days, really, into some paper towels, because they're pretty oily, obviously. But after it's drained, you cut it open, you look at it, spread out the pleats. If there's not a significant amount of metal, then chances are good the engine's fine. And it's also good to save these from one time to another. If you want to save one filter from an oil change, then you can refer to it back. If you see on the next oil change, if you see what you think might be a little bit more metal, you can always refer back to one. I usually put mine in a paper or in a plastic bag and just write the date on them for the oil change so I can refer to them in the future. Compression testing is something that is done on a regular basis on pretty much all engines, and that's something good to do. It's nice to know what the compression should be if it's not listed in a book somewhere. It's good to do that early on in the engine's life so you know what strong compressions are. If you get to the point where you're having some cylinder scuffing, usually you lose a little bit of compression in that area as well. So that's an easy test to do. Borescope inspections too. This is a good one. Borescopes are getting to the point where they're very cheap. You can get a lot of really nice pictures, good quality pictures out of fairly inexpensive borescopes, and they really tell you a lot. Pull out a spark plug, feed a borescope down there. You can look at the valve faces. You can look at the cylinders. This is probably the number one best way to find cylinder scoring is with the borescope inspection. So you can take a lot of pictures and really tell you a lot about what's going on inside the cylinders without actually having to tear off the cylinder heads, things like that. So, and finally, what does your gut tell you? That's always kind of something that a lot of times, we'll see metals that everything looks fine in the oil analysis, but you'll see, something just engine isn't just not quite running right. And so that's always good to listen to your gut. If you think something's wrong, chances are good it's right, or you're correct. You know how your engines are operating, you know what's normal. So if something doesn't seem right, now it's time to start thinking about potentially take it into a mechanic if you don't do that yourself, and dig into a little further. But trust your gut in that regard because it's usually pretty good. We get questions about break-in samples, and the break-in period on newer engines is really not much of a factor. They don't typically have any problems with break-in. Certain aircraft engines that have problems with break-in, they'll get cylinder glazing and use a lot of oil, and they have serious problems. But in the liquid cooled world, especially, break-in aren't necessarily a problem. But and for a big thing on these, what we see typically is high silicon and high metals. The silicon's going to be from sealers and lubes. The metals show up from a break-in of new parts. And so we get the question, why sample at this point? And if you're dealing with a factory engine, I'll tell you right now, you don't need to, because chances are good that engine's going to be solid coming out of the factory. They build thousands of these, and they've got procedures down to where it's extremely rare to have problems out of factory engines. But more importantly, if you're having an engine rebuilt by somebody, it doesn't matter what their reputation is. And there's a lot of good builders out there. I'm not going to ding anybody, and I don't have any recommendations on builders because I don't have enough information on who does a good job and who does a bad job. But if you have an older engine rebuilt, you're really probably going to want to sample the very first oil out of the engine. What that is going to be a high water mark for the metals. So the metals will be the highest that they should ever be really on that first wear-in sample. And then things should improve after that. If you don't see a nice downtrend in metals and a downtrend in silicon, then that can be a sign that something's not right. And you want to know about that sooner rather than later, because aftermarket builders don't generally have very long warranties at all. So you want to stay on top of it, keep an eye on that engine right off the bat. If the wear isn't improving like it should, then you'll want to keep an eye on that and possibly let them know if it turns out to be a problem. So we get the question a lot. You guys really want to talk about oils. So we finally get to the heart of the matter. What's in oil? And oils are pretty simple. You got your base stocks, which would determine if you've got a synthetic or conventional base oil. That's all based on the base stock, and there's different types. And not being in the blending industry, there's a lot I don't know about oils, but I do know quite a bit, and I know they're pretty simple. You start out with your base oils, then they add viscosity index improvers. So this is what turns an oil from a straight weight to a multi-grade oil, and they're different types of polymers. They're like think about maybe the thickest syrup you've ever seen. That would be a viscosity index improver. And then finally, the additives. They buy additive packages for different things. Usually the additives will have some detergent dispersants in there. There'll be some anti-wear additives. They mix all this up together in a heated tank and sell it. And that's the basics for oil. There really isn't that much extra in there. Now there's a lot of marketing that goes on. So the what they put on the bottle is all marketing. And a lot of that kind of harkens back to what the additives they put in there. If this engine's designed to clean, or if this oil is designed to clean your engine, then you know it's got detergent dispersant additives in there. Not really anything special because they all do, but there's a lot of marketing on that. So, but oil in itself in the purest form is really basically simple. These are what they add in there. I know Mobil 1 0W40 is a very popular oil for these engines, and we see a lot of them. I tell all the new writers that we hire, if you're going to be, seeing a Porsche engine and you don't know what type of oil it is, this is the type of oil you should guess it is. And so here's what it looks like in its virgin state. So you've got not much in the way of metals. We usually do see a little bit of metal, 1 or 2 parts per million. All that stuff can be ignored. None of that's a problem. You got molybdenum, which is an anti-wear additive. There's a lot of oils use this at different levels. Boron is a detergent dispersant type of additive. So that's in there to help hold solids in suspension. There's a lot of trace elements like silicon and sodium that generally you don't see much of that or don't have to worry about it. Calcium and magnesium. So calcium is really the big one. All oils should have this, and the calcium is going to be a detergent dispersant additive and that's what's in there to hold solids in the oil, so they can leave the engine when they change and not settle to the bottom of your sump. And phosphorus and zinc, these are anti-wear additives. So there's phosphorus and zinc in virtually every oil out there. There's very few oils off the shelf that you can buy that don't have phosphorus and zinc. It's a good anti-wear additive, commonly known as ZDDP. So viscosity and flash point, if you ever do a virgin sample, here's what it looks like. Basically 0W40 should read like a 40 weight at 100 degrees C. So, and that's the primary temperature that you really that you test oil at. You always do test the viscosity at the temperature that's closest to the operating range of whatever it's in. So there's a low temp viscosity reading out there, a test that you can do that's a viscosity at 40 degrees C. That's considered a low temperature. All engine oil should be run at 100 degrees C. So, and finally here at TBN test, 10.5 is a strong level of TBN. That's based solely on the amount of calcium and magnesium that they put in the oil. So if they want an oil, the blenders want an oil with a high TBN, they'll just pump more calcium and magnesium in there. So moving on. So oils and additives. So this is the big question. Get this all over the time. What oil do we recommend? So this won't make anybody happy, but the short answer is whatever Porsche recommends. And that's our safe go-to, because we get that so often, and there's so many different types of oils out there. There's so many different viscosities. You can't go wrong by going with what the manufacturer recommends. And that's what we say. And we say that because that's how it works. That's what we know. Now, that being said, the long answer is you can use whatever you want. You're more than welcome to experiment. You don't have to use Mobil 1 0W40 just because that's what Porsche says. You can try anything, any other 0W40, anything like that should work, as long as you've got the correct API rating. That's a big one. So if your engine requires a certain API rating, that's what you want to buy. That's what you want to look at when you're buying oil. And if you see 2 or 3 different types that have that API rating, feel free to try them all. You can sample them. You can send it in with oil analysis. You can see how they're doing as far as wear goes, and you can tell how they're doing. If one oil is going to be performing better than another in a certain situation, oil analysis is how you're going to tell. But with that being said, we don't generally see differences in wear between brands. And that's a big reason why we don't recommend any special brand. We're independent company. We're not owned by anybody, so we don't have any reason to recommend anything, but we don't see, if I saw something different, if I saw one oil that maybe did better than another, I'd probably let you know. But we just don't see enough differences in where to make a difference. So that's probably, these answers probably aren't going to make anybody happy overall. But those are the honest answers, from a guy that looks at oil all day. So synthetic versus conventional, that's always a big question. I know most of you guys probably run synthetics, which is fine. The big thing that when I teach our new writers about oils and synthetics is what is the advantage of a synthetic versus a conventional. Synthetics cost more money, so there should be some advantages, right? You would think there would be something. Didn't necessarily see anything, but the big advantage is in the viscosity, and synthetic oils hold their viscosity better at the higher and lower temperature ranges. So the extreme colds and the extreme hots. And one thing to think about is really the extreme colds are the only time you're really going to get that advantage, because extreme hot temperature, you might think, oh, I'm down in southern Texas in the middle of summer. It gets 120 in the shade or whatever like that. That's pretty extreme temperature, but you got to remember that that's nothing compared to the inside of your engine. Your engine oil is running 210 degrees Fahrenheit on a regular basis. And in fact, it likes running that temperature. So the extreme hots aren't really a big factor. And extreme colds are. Now, probably not a lot of you are running these in the middle of winter. So again, you could probably get by with conventional in that regard, but we know most people do use synthetics, and I don't have any problem with synthetics. They're great oils. I run conventional myself, but I've got kind of a cheap streak on the oil that I buy, so that's my problem. Don't expect an improvement in wear from one over another. They aren't necessarily designed to lower your metals. They will tell you they're going to lower their metals, or they will tell you it's designed to improve wear, but that's really just basically because they're putting anti-wear additives in there just like everybody else. So a lot of the stuff as far as hype about improvement in wear and this and that is all pretty much marketing. Feel free to mix brands and weights. It shouldn't hurt anything to experiment. You can change the weights. If you're going to do change weights, I would probably wait until you get, I wouldn't go from if you're supposed to be running a 040, I wouldn't go down to a 520, but you could run a 1040, or you could probably run a 540, something that's still kind of in the ballpark, but not too far away. Again, if it's the same API rating, you should be fine. And aftermarket additives, we don't really see any improvements or needs for those. All the oils that you buy are going to have quite a bit of additive in there. They're going to have all the additives that you need. So you don't typically need any aftermarket additives. So wrapping up a little bit, shipping your sample. If you got samples, you can ship multiple samples in a box. If you order kits from us, we have prepaid mailers, so we make it pretty easy. We pay for the postage coming back. We ship the kits out for free, so there's really nothing, no money changes hands until we actually do the test. Remember to write down your tracking number. You can take a picture of it with your phone. If you're watching a sample come through the mail, if you want to see when it arrives at our lab, and you can also access your reports and tracking info online. We've got the ability on our website to access the reports online, so you don't even need to save them on your computer. In conclusion, feedback is always appreciated. That's something I talked about that earlier. We really do appreciate any extra information you can give us. That's always great to have. And as much information as you can provide, it makes us smarter, and then that in turn helps everybody else. We charge just $35 a sample. That's probably pretty close to what everybody else does. There are a lot of labs out there. I like ours, obviously, but there's other labs that do a good job. So, we're not the only game in town, but you're talking to me, so you're going to hear about my spiel and hear about Blackstone a little bit. So if you're buying a lot, if you're doing a lot of samples too, you can buy them in advance for a discount a little bit. If you do 6 or 12 in a year, it usually pays off. And probably the easiest way, if you want to learn more information, just check our website out, blackstone-labs.com. And, all the information's there. We've got a lot of good example reports. If you want a kit, you can get on there and just fill out, there's a little name and address type thing, send it off, and we send out kits every day for that. So, and that's all I have. So if anybody's got any questions, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen now. So
Well, I have,
maybe there's no questions.
I have a question to ask you.
Sure.
If you want to extend your oil, like I'm running 0.40 in my Porsche. I usually get a TBN, a total base number. If I've got a total base number of 4 or 5, is that oil used up at that point?
No, generally we don't start worrying about the total base number until it reads down in the area 2. And that's probably, you probably won't reach that in a normal run. So usually the active additive that's in the oil, there's plenty of it in there. The TBN holds steady for a long time, and you don't really have to change based on that. Usually people will come up on they'll have some other reason to change the oil. They'll have to do some maintenance or something like that. But yeah, if you had the TBN of 4 or 5, if everything else looked good on the report, chances are good. If you asked about extended oil use, we'd say, yeah, you could go an extra 2,000 miles, check back at that point, and we'll let you know how things look.
Okay. I got another question from Tad C. He said, my 2019 Macan S burns more oil than any Porsche I've ever had. Service tells me that's normal due to the thinner oil recommendation by the manufacturer. I've heard elsewhere mechanically that if I use a 520 instead of a 0.40, I'll not be adding a quart every 5,000 miles and will suffer no ill effects. And then my engine will last longer. What do you think about that?
Well, that's that's a good question. If engines start burning oil, that's going to be something that you'll have trouble at a lot of dealerships getting them to listen to you if it's burning more oil than you think. And some dealerships are better than others. Some mechanics are better than others. If you go to them and can prove that here it was burning 1 quart and now it's burning more, then you might have a better case or a better time of proving that you might have a problem. As far as burning more oil than what you had burned in the past, I've heard of situations where if you try different oils, it will change it. So that would be something that if it's really getting annoying to where you're having to add a whole bunch of oil, generally in that case, it would be worth a shot to try a thicker oil or a thinner oil. I don't exactly know. It can change with okay, I've been running thicker oil and I'm burning it. So if I go to thin, maybe I won't, or vice versa. It's hard on those situations to really get an idea what might help. But I think it is safe to experiment in a lot of situations. You shouldn't hurt anything, especially if you just do one oil run on something lighter or heavier than what you had traditionally been using. If it does help oil consumption, that might be a good reason to do it.
Okay. And I got okay, we have a couple of questions here. Does Scott asked, does new oil in a sealed plastic bottle age? If so, how many years before it should be discarded?
I'd say no. And for that, I would probably keep it. I wouldn't have a problem using oil that if it was in a sealed bottle, if it was 10 years old, I'd use it. It shouldn't have a problem. Sometimes the additives will settle out. So that can be a situation. Typically, if you shake it up, you can get those to go back in suspension. But really, you get some settling of the additives even on new oil. If you've ever, dumped a quart in, if you look at the bottom, there's usually a little bit of sludge at the bottom of an oil jug, and that's just additive that falls out of suspension. So there's always some of that. Maybe 10 years is about the max. That's probably not to say, but if it's just been sitting on your shelf for 2 years, go ahead and use it. Don't throw it away or anything like that.
Okay. Ted has asked, what are the differences between the two averages on the report, unit slash location versus universal average?
Okay, good question. Thank you. So universal averages and all the averages are based on the engine type. So, you know, for certain vehicles, going to have a certain type of engine. Universal averages are going to be everybody's samples that we've seen for all, as long as we've had that engine type in our system. If it looks normal, we'll put them into universal average. So that's pretty much everybody's average. Unit location averages are your average for a particular type of engine. So if you've done one sample on that engine and it looked good, we'll include that into unit location averages, and that first sample will be exactly the same as the current data on the far left. As you do more samples, we'll put those into the unit location averages as well as the universal averages. So unit location averages are your average for a particular engine. Universal are everybody's all over.
Okay. I have another one. It said, how detrimental is the highest levels of fuel dilution in higher compression DFI engines? Anything to defer this?
You know, DFI engines do have their own kind of, you know, they have their own, I wouldn't say problems, just kind of operational difficulties in certain situations. I know they have trouble with intake valves where non-direct fuel injection engines, those intake valves are always running cool because they're always seeing spray of fuel right on them. Anytime it reads over 2%, you know, that's pretty much can potentially be a problem. Or if you find you always have 1% no matter what. And even if you do everything right, if you go out on the highway and get the oil nice and hot, come home, change the oil right then when the oil's hot, shouldn't have any fuel at all. If we continually see fuel, then it's possible there's a problem in that regard. Again, we won't generally harp too much on it until we see it over 2%. And then usually we'll have to see it a couple times in a row. But if it's reading 2%, then the next time it's reading 3%, the next time it's 4% or in that area, then you know something's not right. And that would be a good time to go to a mechanic and tell them you think you got something going on, and they might be able to figure it out.
Okay, well, I don't know the answer to this, so I don't know what DFI engines refers to. Can you elaborate? Because if I don't, I tend to think others don't as well.
Sure, DFI generally stands for direct fuel inject.
Okay.
So instead of injecting the fuel right before the intake or in the intake port before the intake valve, they will actually directly inject fuel right in the combustion chamber like diesel engines.
Yeah,
And you
I
can
know what
get
DFI
better,
is.
yeah, you can get better fuel economy that way. There's a lot of advantages to it. The disadvantages are those systems are fairly complicated because, you know, they have to shut off and turn on the injector every time, whereas especially on your older Porsches, they're going to have like what's known as a CSI or CIS, continuous injection system.
Correct.
Where they're always spraying fuel. They don't ever shut it off. And they just figured, you know, the valves are opening and closing fast enough that there's no reason to shut the fuel off. But
And stays in the manifold anyway, right?
Yeah, correct.
And then vaporizes. Yeah, okay.
But direct fuel inject, those are pretty common anymore. And that's something as engine manufacturers are starting to really strive to get fuel economy and performance. That's something that you'll start seeing a lot of. So.
And Gary asked a question. Say you're adding 1 quart from a 5-quart container. Should you shake the new oil container prior to adding the oil to disperse the additives?
It does. You don't have to. I've run into that same situation. I never shake the oil container on mine. They always have a little bit of additive falling out of suspension. It doesn't hurt anything. If you feel better shaking it, go right ahead. But you don't feel like you have to, or you did something wrong if you didn't do it. So.
Yeah, I have another one here. It says, I understand the ZDDP levels were reduced when catalytic converters were implemented due to contamination of the converters. Older flat tappet camshafts need the ZDDP additive to prevent heavy wear. Is there a problem with too much ZDDP?
The thing about additives in oil is there's diminishing returns when you put certain amount of additive in there, and what you can figure is what Mobile One or what's in Mobile One is going to be more than enough ZDDP for anything. So you can add extra additives in there. They will show up in our reports. You'll be able to see the additive at the higher levels of zinc and phosphorus. I don't know that they help anything. And I've heard of that rumor. There's seems like that came out maybe 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer, that the low ZDDP levels were causing flat tappet problems. And I've never seen it. I know there's enough additive in there that the flat tappets in my truck work just fine. So that's and another thing on that's kind of a side note, but we do a lot of aircraft samples. They run their air-cooled engines. They run ashless dispersant oils. So the oils are completely different than automotive oils and gas engines, or even air-cooled automotive engines. Those oils don't have any ZDDP in them at all, but they still run flat tappets in a lot of those. So I think a lot of the ZDDP stuff has been kind of blown out of proportion, and it's caused a lot of stress. People think that they have to have this additive in there. They got to buy an extra additive just because they've got an older engine, and you really don't need to. If you buy any modern oil, it's going to have enough ZDDP in it. ZDDP is a good anti-wear additive. But it does cause problems with a catalytic converter, along with all the other additives that don't, when they burn, they get into the catalytic converter, they do what's known as poisoning the converter by plugging up all the little ports that go in there, and catalytic converters are expensive. So, it's more of a problem if your engine's burning oil. If your engine's not burning oil, you can put additive in there, especially if you don't have a catalytic converter, I guess. It doesn't hurt anything. But I don't want people to feel like they have to add it. Don't feel like you have to go online and buy a special additive, because whatever you put in there, Pennzoil, Mobile One, Amsoil, all that stuff's going to have more than enough ZDDP to protect your tappets, and you'll be just fine. So hopefully I can relieve a little stress in that regard.
Okay, I actually have two more questions, but let me, will injector cleaners drop out into the oil and affect the test results?
No, typically anything that's added to the fuel gets burned up, and we don't even know about it. We can't see it. Unless if it's an octane booster of some sort, we'll usually see those show up in the oil. But injector cleaners, no, those are solvents, and they'll burn right up. So,
okay. And the last question. I recently bought a new Porsche Boxster GTS 4.0 and was surprised to learn that it requires a unique Mobile One 040 meeting Porsche C40 instead of the viscosity available at 040 European car formulas that meets the Porsche and Audi and Volkswagen requirements. If I understand it correctly, the reason for the new C40 oil is that its formulation has been changed to support the particulate filters that are now installed in the exhaust systems. I have also read that it is not too acceptable to use the C40 oil in Porsches built prior to the particulate filters. The earlier Porsches require the A40 oil. Can you verify if the above statements are correct? If the C40 oil is not approved for earlier Porsche engines, what is it about the C40 oil that is unsatisfactory for the older engines? And how does this impact engine longevity? And won't this also apply to the new engines? And what are the formulation differences between A40 and C40?
So on that one, there's a lot of different specifications for oils that, each manufacturer might have their own specification. I really don't know what those are. We don't keep up on that type of stuff. In fact, a lot of that stuff, we don't know if a change happens until our customers tell us. So, but changes like that, where they change it to do something like to protect a diesel particulate filter, that's going to be kind of along the same lines of of not wanting to poison your catalytic converter. So chances are good that oil, and again, I haven't seen that oil exactly, so I don't know for sure. But if you were to sample that side by side with the other specification, the newer specification probably has less additive in it. If they design that oil to protect something like a diesel particulate filter, then the problem would be if the engine started burning oil. If that oil gets burned up, then if it's got less additive, then it'll take longer for it to destroy the diesel particulate filter, just like it would on a catalytic converter. And if it's got less additive, then that's might be why they don't necessarily, I wouldn't say that it probably wouldn't work in the older engines, but maybe it just isn't ideal for those engines because it doesn't have as much additive as those engines were designed to use. So I'm sorry on those. There's a lot of specifications on that. We don't do near the number of tests that you would have to do to rate an oil for like an API rating. There's a whole list of tests, and they're extremely expensive and very complicated to do. So, there's a lot of stuff like that you would think us being an oil lab would know it, but unfortunately we don't in that regard. But I do know a lot of times when they change something like that, it's because they change additives in there. There are diesel oils out there now coming out that look extremely different than what they had traditionally used, and most of that's just designed to protect the emission control systems. So,
Well, we're running out of time, so I'm going to say, Ryan, thank you very much for speaking to us and enlightening us, and I appreciate it. I'm sure that most of the people that were here also appreciate it.
all right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us. I hope I didn't bore anybody to death, and I do appreciate talking.
And there were 3 other questions that came in that we just ran out of time for, and maybe the best thing to do is just email Brian at the laboratory.
Yeah, you can, if you want to forward those to me, I'd be glad to answer them and reply as best I can.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Simon. I appreciate it. Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Gordy.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
You guys have a good night.
Great.